Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jonathan Dickstein, Assistant Professor of Jain and Vegan Studies at Arihanta Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the Engaged Jain Studies podcast brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Our guest today is Maneesha Deckha, Professor and Lansdowne Chair in Law at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, where she directs the Animals in Society Research Initiative. Her research expertise includes critical animal law, vegan ecofeminist theory, and postcolonial theory. Maneesha, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me.
So we're going to dive right in, as we always do on this podcast, and also begin with the question that, at least when I'm the host, I ask all of my guests. And that question is, how did you first get radicalized for animals? And in other words, how and when did you first realize that we, as a society, and I think we can kind of use that in a global sense, regard and treat animals in fundamentally unjust ways? When did that kind of first occur and then develop in you?
That occurred in my high school years, just kind of on the cusp of going into university. I have an elder brother who went away to university first and then came home with some animal rights literature that I took a look at and was just shocked. I recall there was a pamphlet about just like a mother cow and her calf. And I was just like immediately affected. And so I became, I think, vegetarian right then and there and started to just think more about animal choices. And then when I went to university, I just read more and tried. This was in the early 1990s. So it wasn't like there were clear animal specific courses, but in the kind of social justice type of curriculum I had developed for myself, like courses in women's studies and global South, social movements, postcolonial politics, political theory, philosophy, anthropology. I was able to take some courses where there were a few readings talking about animals. So then I just, not explicitly, but more like in novel form. And so then I just started to read more authors on my own, including Carol Adams, Sexual Politics of Meat. And that's like was really eye-opening because I was going more into like feminist theory very deeply, but none of anything that I was listening to in my undergraduate years in university talked about animals as part of kind of the narrative of deconstruction at that time or social justice or any other type of like radicalized frame. And yeah, so it was an experience at home, opening my eyes with the kind of advocacy pamphlet and then reading more like fiction and then scholarly texts about it, and then trying to pursue that academically in papers here and there. And then really when I went to law school.
Mm. And what was the status then and now of your elder brother? Did it take root in him as well? You said he brought home the pamphlet.
Yes,
That
he
was
had
effect.
he had become vegetarian, and that commitment is largely, I think, overwhelmingly still there. Yeah, they're not into the analysis of veganism yet, despite my efforts. So, but we'll see, right?
Well, now that you describe that, then I'm curious because it really seems like you were saying that when you were in school and reading certain texts, you were trying to find a way to weave animal issues into what you were
Yeah.
studying, into feminist theory, into postcolonial theory. So that makes me curious. I mean, what was the general kind of response at the time, whether it's from other students or teachers, and I don't know what stage of your kind of education
Yes.
you want to speak to, but I'm always curious, kind of, I have my own experience as well. Is like, what was the general reception and response?
So in undergrad, right, to be very generous to all my instructors and professors at the time, it was like 1992, 93, 94 at McGill University in Montreal. So yeah, like most of them, I was in humanities, social sciences courses, so the assessments were largely term papers, and with some freedom to devise, a lot of freedom to devise their topic with respect to the materials. So I think I wrote in undergrad at least 3 papers, taking animal theme. I remember writing for a feminist English literary criticism class about Alice Walker's work time. So she had written a short story, Am I Blue, about a horse that sold it, and made the analogy between African American slavery in the United States and what the experience of these horses. And then looking at her kind of other texts in that regard. Yeah, I would say, I would think, my professors were able not to, I don't think, mark me so much down for it. I still, was happy with the result academically. But yeah, it was probably difficult for them. But because I was able to like connect it to the deconstructed like teachings they had. And so deconstruction is, just this idea that we have all these naturalized categories that we inherit through certain canonical Western thought about dualisms and hierarchies. And these were the hierarchies that were being deconstructed or unpacked. And so I was like, well, man and woman and nature culture and mind and body and reason and emotion hierarchies, like this obviously relates to subordination, not just of women, but of animals. So like the argumentation was really solid, and I could show the themes, and I can recall from some of the comments, like, obviously they're not fully there. I don't think any of my professors were accosted by these views probably before, but for the most part, they were able to come along with me. When I went to law school 3 years later, law school tends to be more conservative than kind of undergraduate spaces in Canada at that time. So, and the first year curriculum is mandated and a lot of exams. So it was really, in the second year, you still keep taking a lot of doctrinal exam-based courses. But in my third year, I was able to take more critical theory paper courses, both in feminist theory and then a directed reading. And I recall my feminist theory class doing something on animals, and that was, well received. But the director reading was all on animals. So there wasn't any professor at the University of Toronto Law School at that time who was focused on animals. Now, University of Toronto Law School has an animal law program. Here at the University of Victoria, very early on, for more than several years now, we've had an Animal Society research initiative. But now there is this initiative at the University of Toronto, which is well known globally. And there's an animal law program. So quite a change. But when I was there in 95, 98, no one. So I found a professor that was interested in critical theory in general, and he and I wrote basically what was like the very early draft of my monograph, Animals as Legal Beings, which came out like 20 years later than when I wrote it. But very, very early draft. And he was hugely receptive. Again, not a very likely not a vegetarian even then. Probably the first time someone wrote. But I had the occasion, Jonathan, just last week being at a symposium paying tribute to that feminist legal theory professor I had, Professor Jennifer Nadelsky, and her relational feminist influence throughout the world. And we were on an animal law panel, myself and her former students. And also I met the professor who had supervised my directed reading, which was like the very first iteration, Professor Craig Scott. Both of them are now at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto too. And he said to me, right, like, Maneesha, you were a pioneer at that time because I really just did a whole thing on animals, and he was extremely supportive at that stage. So it shows the power of critical thinking. Of course, there are a lot of, at that workshop too, you can also see kind of the tendency to delve a little bit in this conference, in a conference into the more than human and the theories and the buzzwords that go with that. But yet the catering kind of stays dominant. So I but I was able to address that in a critical question answer moment toward the end of the conference about the disconnect here. Yeah, so there's like formidable cognitive biases, now and certainly back then. But the response, I think, was overall like positive.
Well, that's nice to kind of so many years later get not confirmation necessarily of your work, but to hear from someone like how you were a pioneer and we didn't like have that back then. Look where we are now. That's pretty amazing.
That is really amazing, yes. And I would just add that I did my job talk almost a quarter of a century ago on animals, because that's the only thing that's really qualified, relating it to why basically, the theory of intersectionality or like, just the idea of like why do animals fit in the narrative of social justice and why do we keep excluding them? So I did a talk on that. And that was, I mean, I got my job, I had an offer elsewhere too, and very generously. So that was well received. Again, in a room where maybe there were one or two other, even just vegetarians in the audience, not even vegan. So yes, remember we are in Canada, so there.
It's really great though. I have a colleague, he's a professor who I'll never forget one thing he said to me. He said, which might not sound like a compliment, but it's kind of the biggest compliment I think I have as an educator. He said, I wish I had a professor like you when I was an undergraduate, because I wouldn't have thought I was crazy. Like I wouldn't have thought I was like crazy, which I did. And the reason it says that is that whether it's like, the work I've worked on, whether it's on animals, sometimes whether it's on philosophy, it's like, there's a lot of people, right, as undergrads who feel so on the margins or ostracized, whether in identity or in thought. But I guess the point is that like you just described a story where there was a moment in which you actually found someone who was receptive and made you think like this does have a home. This is relevant. I'm not crazy. I don't think you thought you were crazy. And I also use that term very loosely. I'm not using it in some kind of ableist sense. I just mean it the way that my colleague had shared it. But it's important, I guess, even now that there are figures in universities that can help people who are interested in these animal issues, because they will be marginalized still, I think, by the majority of the institution. So
Yes.
it was really
Yeah.
nice that when you said that you finally did find some support, that you kind of worked through it, but then you eventually did find a mentor of sorts who was extremely supportive.
Yes. No, and it's really important, right? Because even today, it's still, as much as it has come into visibility in academia and their conferences and journals and growing opportunities, comparatively, it is still peripheral, right? And, studying this, pursuing it, it's not like the favorite thing of the day with all the opportunities like being thrown at you for what you're studying. You really have to be committed and believe in it. So you could still have thoughts of just, you're always kind of swimming against the current, which is not easy to do. So
Yeah.
definitely it's important to have professors to turn to who can assist with that. Yeah. Yeah. So things have changed in a generation.
That's great. So there's a question I'm gonna pin for the moment, but I do it because we talked about how later on your journey through school and a lot of the work that you landed on eventually is on animals and the law, right? And this is a particular kind of area that not everyone. Some people get into animal ethics or animal advocacy or whatever else, the history of the animal rights movement. But this is more of your home. So how did that become a kind of focus for you? And I really mean, like, when did you say come to some perception or understanding that it was critical to work on the plight of animals via legal systems?
Jonathan, I'm not sure. Like I was an undergrad and I knew my passion and I wanted a future in just pursuing kind of critical thinking and writing on social justice issues. And I also knew I wanted a fairly comfortable life. And I've also kind of been informed by, as we are, by, what we hear as children as to what's important and what to reach or what to. So it's like, well, I think a lot of people go to law school, they don't want to do sciences and they're not having full passion in graduate school, one topic. So they kind of by default end up in law school. That's probably one thing that has not changed in a generation. And I had way more kind of science side of my family, but also some justice law side going back generations, really to my maternal grandfather in the
Oh, wow.
kind of nonviolence Gandhi movement, anti-colonial movement in India. So I felt like some, comfort going to law school. And then I was like, well, yeah, because I'd already, writing as an undergrad outside of law school, it was still kind of justice oriented. It just wasn't in the kind of more structured, precise legal frame. And so when I was in law school, then I really felt like the compassion and justice lens I usually bring to everything really made sense. And when I finally felt for myself that I had the freedom in law school in my third year to take the courses, I really wanted where one could write rather like an essay rather than an exam. That's where I thought I really just want to write something about animals in this directed reading project. So directed reading is not a formal course; you devise your own, and if you can get a supervisor. So yes, and then I just knew that I would really in undergrad. I always wanted to be an academic, and then law school I kind of wavered in that just because of thinking, am I good enough to do this in the legal sphere? And the professors I had that I mentioned really es- gave me the confidence to pursue it and support it. Really encouraged me. Yeah, and it's just I knew I always wanted to teach a course, which I started to teach. My job talk on animals was just, the call came pretty quickly and I had to give an interview. And, at that time, doing something in front of faculty seemed, extremely anxiety producing for me. And I was like, well, this is something I know really well. And I actually, received advice, well-intentioned advice, don't give a job talk on animals. You're never going to get the job. And I said, well, I have to go saying something I know really well and feel really
And
confident.
you probably know better than most people there because they've not been working on that. They've not been working.
Yes.
It's not an area that you're going into someone else's kind of wheelhouse.
Yes, but through the frame of intersectionality, which by then a lot of Canadian academics did know. This was early 2000s, very early 2000s. And yeah, so then I was, when you start, I was like, well, I'd like to teach a seminar on this. And I just kept writing about it because it was really the number one thing close to my heart then. I just always felt an abiding sense of empathy for animals and, just extreme sadness and horror at the quality of their lives. And I wanted to do something. I really wanted to speak to the, scholars on the left who felt like they were doing the utmost for addressing vulnerability and precarity and discrimination and inequality. But, I just thought and still think there's a huge gap not being addressed. And I wanted to make the arguments to open the channels of communication here in disability.
Makes sense. And maybe we can come back to that because especially when you said then and now seem little has changed. Or I mean more has changed, but there still seems to be this resistance. And maybe we can come to that later when I'm kind of curious at what you think maybe then and now about ways we might approach that. But staying within the realm of law, so like for people who are listening, they may have heard a few things about the property status of law of animals in the United States. But I guess, I don't know, if you could kind of summarize, maybe if you're thinking in the Canadian context, but maybe any others by way of comparison, like how would you generally describe the legal status of animals? And I know when I say animals, right, we could say which animals, where animals, but in just like kind of on the street, if someone was asking you to give a high level picture of what the legal status of animals is and how we might compare, say, different frameworks, what might be, how would you respond?
I would say, oh, they're a property. And it really doesn't, although different industries are either not regulated or differently regulated, the overwhelming status of property, from the favored cetaceans to the disfavored rodents and insects and farm animals, is one of property. So that means in systems that are kind of globally dominant because of the histories of empire building from the French and English, you have in former English colonies and still ongoing what's called the common law, and then in former French colonies and still ongoing in some parts of the world, the civil law. So both create a norm, and then sometimes it's made explicit that animals are property. So what does that mean? That means that in law, whatever is classified as property is not a subject of law. It is rather an object to which property rights attach. So when we say, I own my computer, I own my phone, that computer and phone are kind of objectified, and what we as not just like social persons but legal persons, so the law recognizes now all human beings as legal persons domestically in I think every jurisdiction and also at international law levels. This is not to say that that protection of even humans as legal persons results in proper protection, right? We can see the scales of war, conflict, and genocide, that's not the case.
To slow down for a second, just so I'm on the same page. So when you say a legal person and a subject of the law, would those be synonymous terms?
Yes. So the subjectivity of legal personhood makes us a subject, makes us a someone
Yes.
in the legal system, right? And when we are someone, that means the law can see us as an actor who, in the kind of paradigmatic example, can enter like contracts, right? We can sue or be sued. We can marry, right? We can receive benefits. We can create legal instruments. So we just have this presence in the law. And then what are we kind of arguing about in a legal dispute is like typically sometimes what's happening to our person. So it might be a claim against a state about rights violation, but often it's about property rights, right? Just given the capitalist nature of our state, like you do a real estate transaction or you get a job, it's an element of property, even when you're like contracting your services or payment. And whatever is the thing at issue, like a book or a new outfit or a new computer, we as legal subjects are recognized as having certain rights to use that property. So let's think of our phones. We are allowed to, being an owner of the phone, what does that mean? That means fundamentally you are allowed to use your phone. And often that means you are allowed to exclude others from using your phone, right? That's like the big kind of distinction. Not just you are allowed to do stuff, you get the right to exclude others from touching and using your property. And who's going to force that? Oh, the state. The state will help you in excluding others. Like you don't have to keep fighting everyone to hands off. The state has an apparatus that we invest in socially to help you. Okay, so an animal as property does not have this ability as subject. So even when we think there's gross harm to animals, like a preliminary issue that comes up, well, they can't sue because like they're just an object of property rights. And then when you cannot sue to protect yourself, you need someone to stand for you. But that is not a straightforward claim that you can make in a court. And this is the issue of standing about, well, who can be there making a claim. So when you're a legal person, you have a lot of rights and privileges. And when you're an object of property, you have like no privileges and really no rights. So some scholars think, well, there are anti-cruelty statutes, and that does give a so-called right to shelter, right to have adequate water, right to have adequate food, to continue to be used, let's say in an industry, whether it's research or agriculture, what have you. And often, just to be clear, these anti-cruelty statutes don't even apply to normative industries because either there's a explicit carve-out in the legislation or it's implicitly interpreted that way. So in the rare moment where they might apply, which is typically to companion animals in the house that have a higher culturally favored status but still are treated as property legally, some scholars will say, okay, well, that's kind of like a small r type of right, or what's called a simple right. I myself, I don't follow that line of thought. I think a right means like what has historically, we believe it to mean a fundamental right, not to be exploited. So a fundamental right, like right to life, right to liberty, right to freedom of the person, or bodily security. So the property status of animals will apply to It's certainly that the culturally objected and legally objected animals like farmed animals, but also to the animals that are favored. So companion animals. A lot of jurisdictions in the United States, Canada, well, Canada less so, just British Columbia first, have laws that say, okay, upon human relationship breakdown, we are going to think of the interests of the animals, and they might even say best interests of the dogs and cats. And that has been a change in the law for sure. But they still don't make those animals persons. So they give them some treatment. And so in 2019, Canada for the first time banned the captivity of one type of species, cetaceans. So we had the blackfish that had effects, and that resulted in a federal ban against future bringing into captivity and future breeding of current captives or future whales. So again, like a huge milestone, because there's no other animal species that we say it's illegal to keep in captivity except through endangered exotic wildlife. But we don't talk about these animals as persons. They're still property.
Yeah, so I think that's an important point, and it kind of will help me ask you another question. But I think what that brings to mind when you have a situation in which you have made it a law to keep, say, cetaceans in captivity, and right, it seems like you're trying to get the foot in the door, right? This is like a foot in the door method of well, if that's the case, then obviously we have to start extending this logic elsewhere. And I'm often when you brought up computers, I was thinking about how in so many states in the United States, I'm sure in Canada, right, there are clauses that if you come across like an overheating car and there's a dog inside and that dog is overheating and suffering, you actually have a right to violate property rights for the sake of the welfare of someone else's property, which sounds antithetical, right, to the status of animals under the law, right? If an animal is just property under the law, then in some way I shouldn't be permitted legally to break into your car. I mean, it's not like I look at your computer overheating in the back seat of your car and I say, "Oh my God, that's a new MacBook Pro. I need to break this window really quickly." So it's kind of interesting. I guess my point is it seems like there are these fissures or there are these gaps in which the law can't ignore that animals are not mere property in some way because it seems kind of ridiculous, right?
Actually, with that example, Jonathan, 9 times out of 10, we don't have the legal right.
Yeah.
You break into the car, even as the dog is dying. So there's some now movement to allow for that. Right? Because the public opinion stands by it, and many legal powers to be have dogs and cats and understand this with
Yeah.
companion animals. But certainly, yes, there are, it's not like a solid blanket of objectification and property status. There are little moments, but it is an overwhelm.
Yeah.
It is like a foundation of property status with some things layered on top. And the big question is that enough, or does the property status have to break? So the some things later on top, I think the most standout of an additional layer that's trying to value animals are not just anti-cruelty statutes, which are kind of ordinary laws that say, if you look at the history of anti-cruelty statutes, which Professor Gary Francione has done in the United States with this early book in 1995, he will argue that the anti-cruelty statutes aren't about animals. They're just about what you cannot do to another owner's objects, right? And then when an owner is charged with anti-cruelty against their own animals or cruelty against their own animals, it's about social norms about how to protect property, not about protecting animals. So to have a good economy, you need to keep your animals well fed so that they can, contribute and be in the kind of food system properly. So, and that's very persuasive. Now, if we concede maybe that in contemporary times, since his analysis, anti-cruelty statutes are there for animals themselves and not about the overall idea of an economy and capitalism and what's good for the society or the rights of owners. The standout expression of this would be certain jurisdictions, about a handful around the world, that have constitutional recognition of animal sentience. So constitutionalists stand out because what is a constitution is like the highest law of the land that trumps all the other laws. So when you have a conflict, the constitution wins. And to put something in the constitution means that we as a society, we think something is hugely important that it should be adverted to in the Constitution, even protected. So, jurisdictions like Switzerland, Germany, India, Ecuador, Bolivia have constitutional expressions like protecting kind of biodiversity, rights of nature, or animal species, talking about animals as dignity or animals as sentient. Even Quebec, in the Canadian system, we have in the civil system, we have an expression of animal sentience. But this hasn't resulted in stopping the industries that exploit animals, for example. So it, you have like a property foundation. You do have recognition of sentience at very high levels in a handful of jurisdictions around the world in terms of these animals are sentient, they attach a dignity, yet that has not translated into like any hard stops of normative industries.
Okay. So I'm gonna, this always gets me too super interested, and I'm like, oh my God, when are we gonna, how can we circle back? But I actually find it fascinating, and I'm sure others would be interested in the history, and they could obviously look to Gary Francione's work. But we do have, say, dog fighting is illegal, I believe, in all 50 states in the United States, right? And I don't know about cockfighting, and I know that it has ties to things like gambling and other like criminal enterprises and so on. But it seems to be that a lot of the reasons why these things are banned, at least, I don't know, what you're saying might be just social norms, is the kind of torture that's involved. So, or the kind of the spectacle that's involved with dogs who otherwise have this property at privileged position. So, I mean, I guess my own way of thinking about it is like the ways in which the law inscribes property status, but conflicts with developing social norms. And it seems like there are those moments where, well, why shouldn't dog fighting be legal if I
It's
can do
actually,
whatever?
Jonathan, that's another example.
Am I giving terrible examples when you're going to tell me that none of these have to do with actual animal welfare and things are much worse than I even thought they were?
Perhaps. I mean, I've written about historically, like what is the genesis of anti-cruelty statutes, right? Coming out of England, like over 200 years ago now. What I've argued is that yes, certainly the advocates that took them forward cared about animals, but how did they get majority, kind of support in the legislatures to pass into law? You had to, tie them to civilizational narratives about, like England has to be a beacon, a role model for the world. So we need to show that we're treating our animals properly because we can't very well go and criticize other cultures for what they're doing to women and children if we're not stand up about it. Also, you had like kind of domestic civilization projects about, well, you know, fighting on the street is becoming illegal, but fox hunting doesn't become illegal. Like why? Because of the perception of what these practices are. So one is extremely classed, right, and seen to be not valuable, not laudable, not about tradition, not about British identity, and that gets targeted, right? And so that's a critique of anti-cruelty statutes. Like, what do these statutes say? Even in the current day, there should be no unnecessary suffering. That's basically like what they boil down to. No unnecessary suffering for animals. We know animals suffer immensely in factory farms. But what gets targeted as unnecessary suffering are usually the practices of human groups that are seen to be culturally or religiously aberrant, right? And so, but the dog fighting, before, as example, before Canada banned the cetaceans in captivity, you know, the handful of other things that are outright banned, not subject to like an unnecessary suffering calculus, I can count on one hand, and they're from like over 100 years ago because of that inheritance from Britain and the idea that fighting of animals doesn't serve any type of laudatory purpose. But even if I think, Gary Francione opened Animals, Property, and Law in 1995 with a trap shooting event.
Mhm.
This is seen as being sport, right? And or a captive shooting, even though you could easily say this is not necessary.
Yeah. I like fox hunting, which is obviously ongoing and
Yes.
traditional narrative.
So I wouldn't say that like dog fighting, animal fighting is about the actual welfare of animals. The history of it shows it's actually, as so many animal issues are, and the regulation or actually non-regulation of protecting animals is about human identity and interhuman hierarchies. A lot about class, a lot about race, and a lot about gender.
Wonderful. Because, yeah, I actually was curious about that. I also wanted to use that as a means to come to my next question, where I was asking specifically if you can give examples, and I think dogfighting is a great example, and Claire Kim writes about this, right, in her book about dogfighting, specifically in the Michael Vick case in the United States, which is a great example. But are there other examples then maybe that'll help our listeners who might still think that kind of animal issues, anti-cruelty issues, property issues are kind of this thing separate from all these other human justice kind of issues? So can you kind of describe maybe some other ways in which so-called animal issues are embedded in issues of race, gender, caste, class, and maybe not just an example of that, but what you think is maybe a good way to teach that or to kind of illuminate that for others when you're trying to demonstrate this embeddedness? I mean, you've been doing it, what, for 3 decades now, trying to show this to audiences and so on.
Yes. Okay. So I'll go back to Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat, where she makes the case, like ecofeminists have, vegan ecofeminists, that the oppression of women, the oppression of animals are really linked. You can see that, on the surface when you think of like the pejorative terms that women are called, right? I think we all know kind of like the main pejorative term a woman who seems to be too angry is called, and like, oh, that's what you call a female dog, right? But here it has a pejorative connotation. We can think of other terms that women are frequently called. And, why is that? That this doesn't come out of nowhere. So because the animals themselves are devalued, because they are feminized, and then the women are devalued already because they're feminized, and then their kind of devaluation is extended through an animalization. And there's like this feedback loop, right? And you can see it also just in terms of how we think about farmed animals and the stories we tell ourselves about why it's not so bad, how we treat them, or agriculture is actually a caring industry. And I think listeners have had the opportunity through the Arihanta Institute to be exposed to the really exceptional analysis that Dr. Yamini Narayan gives in her book Mother Cow, Mother India. And I mean, there Dr. Narayan is trying to answer the claims from, even that she kind of felt before, as she talks about in the opening. And certainly I have like thought in years past, and many people think like, oh, well, animals are treated better in India, at least, at least in dairy, because there's like a religious reverence for the cow. So the cow's even seen like as a goddess, as a mother. Like this seems like completely the opposite of objectifying a cow, of treating them just as an absent referent, as Carol Adams has argued. And certainly on the surface it does, but then when you look into like how things are actually thought about in practice, what Dr. Narayan's analysis reveals, like there is an ongoing narrative by people in the dairy industry in India, I mean, at least her interlocutors, the people she kind of interviewed, that yes, of course, things are better here than in the United States or in factory farming and these like local operations, because we kind of see the cow through this religious frame, but also because the cow is our mother. Right now, the mother trope is incredibly gendered, as we can, immediately see. And it tracks onto the idea of mother and the nation, longstanding in India and many other countries. A lot of postcolonial feminist scholars have analyzed completely like outside of the formal animal context how were anti-colonial movements against the British or even the French mobilized? How was the figure of the mother used? And so there's some like liberatory potential of the figure of the mother to mobilize people to say, yes, this is our mother country and we need to kind of resist. At the same time, feminists have analyzed how that gender trope has not gone well for women and what they were expected to do in anti-colonial movements. And so Dr. Narayan extends this to the situation of the cow as mother, and we get an argument or an analysis back from, the individuals involved in dairying in India to say, well, the cow is a mother, we are her children, and so we are like entitled to take her milk, that she wants us to take that milk, and she's going to give us the milk, and we're supposed to take it. So this narrative cannot subsist about animals and why dairying is better in India than it is in the US, and why it's not so bad, and why it's actually kind of justified. And the inability to see it any other way, even as Dr. Narayan is kind of engaging in a respectful conversation, trying to poke at this narrative, is one very much informed by gender ideas about mothers and what they do in the human context, or what they should be doing, right? And then that's projected onto the cow. So we can't understand like what animals are going through if we don't think of these frames coming to us from ideas of intrahuman hierarchies and the ideologies around them. So that's just one example. We can't understand why certain animals might be targeted at a certain time. So there's like feminist analysis of, when are wolves like targeted in like aerial shoots, like in Alaska or elsewhere? And they have traced where it's like a crisis in masculinity happens, like in the human population. And then all of a sudden the wolves are targeted, right? And so why is that happening? Because of the ideas around human politics and then how we project that on to animals. I mean, you think of trophy hunting, but we don't have to go to that extreme example of like toxic masculinity and trophy hunting. We can see it in our regular agricultural industry. And so what Mother Cow, Mother India, sexual politics of meat, these types of feminist analysis show us like the animals that, so many have died as we've been talking, on land and water, like these are the really feminized animals. And feminization is a devaluation in kind of the dominant ideologies. Otherwise, if we feminize things, we don't have to devalue it, right? Feminization could be like an uplifting. Another really current example is just, why if you take seriously, the evidence of double standards between how Western countries have responded to the genocide in Gaza, right? Or the feminine war in Sudan. And you take seriously the critique that we're not able to value the lives of those who are like racialized as much as those that we perceive as white, and we can't value the lives of those who are seen as Muslim as much as we can perceive the value of lives of those who are Christian. So we can't, the media even, and the politicians, like double standards for Israel and Gaza versus, let's say, Russia and Ukraine, and also like no attention on Sudan. Okay, how is this an animal issue? Well, if you take the narrative seriously, you will see the evidence of dehumanization, right? And so once we can dehumanize a population, and this is shown not just in 2023, 24, 25, 26, but so much of human history, once we can then animalize that and say they're subhuman, then that human group is primed for, they are in a state of extreme vulnerability, and the violence that is being done to them is justified and is seen as not so bad and actually needed, right? Either because of anti-terrorism or because of like proper retaliation for an attack or what have you. And that logic does not work unless there are animals that we already animalize and dehumanize and treat really poorly. So
Yeah.
you can use a lot of what social justice advocates at, let's say, in the human realm are complaining about is a dehumanization, whether on the grounds of race, class, ability, gender. That is not going to go away, I have argued, and others have argued, while we still think dehumanizing is okay and not being human is a negative or an inferiority, which, by the way, not all human cultures do, right? Or religions. So that I think that is a really powerful way for people to understand, why do we still have these, you know, never again moments happening again and again, is because this logic is still intact of a hierarchy between the human and the non-human or the subhuman that hurts humans as well as obviously ubiquitously animals and other non-humans.
No, I think these are wonderful examples. Thank you so much for that. And what always astounded me was how social justice discourse, and by that I actually mean human justice discourse, always kind of warned against the rhetoric of dehumanization, subhumanization, animalization. But then you said, well, then shouldn't we be talking about shouldn't we be talking about animals? Like if this is the key thing, is to animalize, how are animals not deeply embedded? Animals themselves deeply embedded in our concern. And I think as you've shown years ago, and I remember reading Syl Ko's work, who was really just amplifying your own work and basically saying how much when we say animalize, it actually doesn't mean to become biological animal. It is to become an entity that has no sake, to become that which is not a subject under the law, to become something that can be, right, exploited without remorse or regret or killed. And so, in the example of Palestine, right, the kind of very famous, infamous use of the phrase like human animals for Palestinians was kind of maybe also the first time I had seen that phrase. Like you usually see people referred to as animals, but rarely was human used as like an adjective, right? They're human animals. So they're fundamentally animals kind of in the form resemblant of humans. And the point was that, no, don't be mistaken. If they were humans, they would be subjects of law. They would have right. But actually, they're animals. In which case, in which Gallant said at the time, like, we're acting accordingly, which meant we're acting with lethal intent, with intent to exterminate. And so you give that example, and it really strikes me very deeply because you just see how embedded the idea of the animal, which is very important not to forget the bodies of animals and the lives of animals and so on, but how intertwined they are. Oh, go ahead, please.
No, I was just going to say I think that's, as I've written before, yes, I have written about that way back when, especially in a piece called The Subhuman as an Agent of Violence, like violence on all levels. And more recently, analyzing a case out of New York with the New York Court of Appeals about Happy, the elephant, still in the Bronx Zoo, and analyzing that case, which was supposed to be obviously about Happy and her ability to access a legal remedy for the first time as a non-human. What I argued was when you look at the majority judgment that said no, flat out no, and the two dissents who said yes, this case was all about race, right? And racial anxiety about what would happen if we uplifted animals to the human animal boundary that kind of keeps newly kind of admitted humans into this sphere, comparatively speaking, as, yes, they're fully human, and yes, the law recognizes them as fully human, that they're still too precariously placed to admit animals into kind of this coveted sphere of what we morally and legally regard as elevated subjects. And so the human exceptionalism and anthropocentric thinking that tries to safeguard human rights, as was happening in the Happy case, by keeping animals out, just does not work, because the animalization trope then is always available, because animalization then equals inferiority. That's the connotation. And then it's always available to keep the precarious humans still precarious, because the subtext is always, well, they're a little bit animalized. And then to, like really, as we see with, the Israeli genocide against Palestinians, just to do full on, like just staggering violence
Mhm.
against a group and the children as well. And really, really like, okay, well, it's not this bad. It's not that bad because of the value of those human lives.
Mm. So even though we haven't been talking about it, maybe some listeners don't know that you're actually producing a class for us at Arihanta, and I want to just use this last question to get to that, because we could talk about these other issues like literally forever. I would love to pick your brain and just listen to you to talk about it at length. But you are teaching a course for us, course 1024, Animal Law in Global Perspective. And just with our kind of remaining minutes, just a few minutes, if you could tell folks who are interested in the class, or maybe just now hearing about the class, like what they could expect from the class itself, and what you think it equips them with that they may not have had beforehand.
Okay, yeah, they can get, like in relatively short form, an overview of what's going on in animal law and what has been going on with respect to the last kind of 50 years. So just as we were as we started this podcast talking about how did I get involved, how are things changing, what do we see in a generation? What I do in the course is to go over, how did animal law become a thing, and like what does it mean, and why is property kind of the focal point for animal law? And then we talk about some of the internal debates in animal law. Seems like, well, yes, we can say property is such a huge problem for animals, but there's no like kind of hope that tomorrow that's going to change, or, next year or in 10 years. And so what have scholars been trying to propose as ways to get people really to care and empathize with animals so that we can see a big dramatic, maybe not dramatic, but a big meaningful change accrue in a shorter time frame. So then those who take the course will get a sense of like the different proposals on the table about how we can move more swiftly, but still meaningfully for animals, not just like little tweaks, but real protections for them in policy circles and in legal circles. And then we get a deeper dive into what's going on with respect to legal advocacy in Western countries, or what you should think of like richer countries in global north, and how the kind of dominant strategy there, which is to humanize animals. And we can understand that as a legal strategy. Like lawyers need strategies. You want to win your cases. Like you're speaking to conservative mindset, and the law itself is conservatively structured. Like judges are not supposed to do big, bold things. They're supposed to rely on what happened before and just make little extensions if at all. And if you're looking for a big, bold change, you got to go to the legislature. But then, of course, the legislature wants to do what's politically popular, right? So you need legal strategies for both venues. And so a prominent legal strategy has been to humanize animals, right? Like, the dolphins, the whales, the non-human primates, the elephants, they're like us. They're intelligent, right? And the like us is, of course, this idea of this paradigmatic human who is like fully rational, fully autonomous, just leading their lives as an autonomous actor. And these arguments have not worked for the most part. And then we also look at some arguments in the global south, like at least South Asia, and then kind of maybe the boundary zone of South America in terms of global north, global south, where we have seen movement and cases for animals. And we learn more about what's going on here and how it's connected more to kind of non-Western thinking or indigenous cosmologies in those areas, but not always. And how like judges who, very likely it's the first time they're thinking about these issues, were able to actually give the animal sanctuary in a way that hasn't happened in North America in the courts. And how has that happened in some cases, right? So what are the similarities, but what are the differences in terms of the results and outcomes for animals based on the theories we learn in terms of like an overview of the last 50 years? What are scholars saying, and how does it come into the social movements and the advocacy movements for animals? So overall, it's like a nutshell course about what animal law is, has it developed, what are the strategies that are being tried out in different parts of the world, and what has worked, or maybe has more potential of working.
Well, I think that's wonderful. And I'm excited really to take the course myself. But I think, for a lot of people who get radicalized, as it were, interested in animal issues, they think like, like, what can I do? Maybe I'll be an academic or a writer, or I'll be activist, or, I don't know, like write some kind of vegan cookbook. But I think, and maybe I know like a student of mine is interested in policy work, but the law is an avenue, especially it seemed to be for someone like you who was really interested in writing, thinking, reading, but also how do I make significant interventions, or where can we make significant interventions to change systems? And, I always think of animal advocacy and just kind of even just, let's just say, liberationist advocacy as a whole as an ecology of tactics, right? An ecology of people and movements working together. And I think it seems that from this course, students can really learn like the kind of state of affairs right now, like where we've come from, where we are, and then maybe if they're kind of like embarking upon a life, like, okay, where could they put their efforts? Whether it's becoming that policymaker or becoming that lawyer or becoming that judge, or maybe it's just kind of nudging your local politicians or other people in a certain directions because they're now more aware of what kind of pillars seem more fragile than others, or what kind of pillars seem more strategic than others. So I really, really hope that listeners will be inspired by this podcast to take the course, and hopefully if it just gives them a lot of information about the the terrain for animal rights and animal liberation in 2026, that's great. But I think it'll inspire quite a few as well.
I hope so. Thank you.
Great. So I just want to say thank you so much, Maneesha, for being with us today. It's been wonderful, and I really think we just kind of scratched the surface of what you could share and teach all of us. So thank you once again.
My pleasure. Yes. And I really look forward to being with the attendees in the course.
Great. So thank you all for being here on this episode of the Engaged Jane Studies podcast, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.